At E-deck, from one to the next, back and back. There's no stopping it.
The pumps, if we open the doors...
The pumps buy you time, but minutes only. From this moment, no matter what we do, Titanic will founder.
Hi guys, welcome back. My name's Sheila and I make video essays and commentaries on Irish culture and depictions of Irish culture in television, film and novels. I was really surprised by the response on my most recent video, which was a video essay, or more so like an informal commentary on Moriarty from Sherlock and also on Heath Ledger's Joker in The Dark Knight. And I got a great response on that video. Well, you know, some comments were less than favourable, but some were very complimentary. I appreciated all of them anyway, because I always like to get feedback. And I figured that I would do things a little differently for this, my next video, in response to that. This was originally, this video on the Titanic was going to be much more scripted. I did do a lot of research for it. I went down a very deep rabbit hole that lasted some months. I've now emerged from that rabbit hole, thankfully. Let's just say I spent a lot of time on the Reddit, on the Titanic subreddit, which is a very interesting place, but I wouldn't recommend that you spend too much time there. Obviously, the Titanic itself is a fascinating historical event, a very tragic and devastating event. It was built by Irish men, which is a fact that is highlighted in James Cameron's film.
He's English, no?
No, it was built in Ireland. 15,000 Irishmen built this ship. Solid as a rock.
Irish passengers and crew also made up a significant portion of the people on board. So that's my justification for making this video, focusing on the Irish aspect of the tragedy rather than on the overall, and keeping things kind of close to discussing James Cameron's Titanic. I did try to watch the Gillian Fellows miniseries, which came out in 2012. I didn't finish it, unfortunately. I also watched A Night to Remember, which is a classic 1958 film that also inspired Cameron's film. So I'll be referring to that a little bit, and also to some documentaries that I watched, but we're mainly going to focus on Titanic 1997. And before I continue, please do make sure to like and subscribe, comment your thoughts down below on what you think of Titanic, the movie, and whether you have any preference as to your favourite Titanic movie or piece of media. So the first thing I want to look at with relation to James Cameron's Titanic is how the film does greatly simplify the complicated class structure when we look at the various passengers on board Titanic. In the film, you know, the main romance between Rose and Jack, which is very famous, and even if you haven't seen the film, I'm sure you've at least seen this clip, is between a first-class woman and a third-class man.
Oh, forget it, Boyle. You just like have angels fly out of your arses get next to the likes of her.
That's the most we really get in terms of class analysis in the film. There's not much attention given to the second class passengers, for instance, or indeed to the crew, although we do get a greater focus on the crew in the second half of the film. And I think this is significant because other Titanic adaptations, even the Gillian Fellows miniseries, but also A Night to Remember, which had a lot of influence on Titanic, really presented a more complicated and, we would have to say, realistic portrayal of the various classes on board and how they would have related to each other. I think the reason why the class structure is simplified in the film Titanic is because as a blockbuster film, it was supposed to have very broad appeal. And as such, for instance, we get the Irish character Tommy Ryan explaining to us why Jack and Rose can't be together. It's assumed that a 1990s audience wouldn't really understand, whereas the 1950s audiences of A Night to Remember would have been much more comfortable and at least would have known a lot more about this class structure, because it was also closer to the time in which the film is set.
Oh, well played, sir. I say, let's go down and join the fun.
They're steerage passengers.
So in Cameron's Titanic, we do get a lot of implausible moments, such as Jack being invited to dinner in the first class restaurant, which definitely wouldn't have happened. third class and second class passengers weren't allowed in first class areas. Jack himself, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, is a bit implausible as a character as well. This kind of free spirit that really connects more with 1990s sensibilities, and specifically 1990s American sensibilities about being free, about deciding your own destiny.
Got everything I need right here with me. Got air in my lungs and a few blank sheets of paper.
So if James Cameron isn't interested in exploring, the complicated class division on board the Titanic, what is he interested in exploring?
Titanic is like a fractal. At first you think you see the pattern, and then when you get closer and closer you realize there are whole other patterns and whole other details that emerge.
Cameron has not only always been fascinated with the Titanic itself, but also with the wreck of the Titanic. He has made several documentaries showing the technology that and the expense of performing these dives at such a great depth. When we look at the effort that Cameron put into recreating the Titanic, it was really an amazing undertaking. His use of practical effects was necessary because CGI had not yet advanced to the point that it now is, and he has admitted since that if he was to make Titanic now, he would use a lot more CGI. I personally am glad that these practical effects were necessary for Titanic because I think it really adds to the overall effect.
My favorite set would have to be the ship set, stage 1. It was virtually the whole ship. The deck heights were accurate. The width of the ship was made accurate.
There was even a deleted scene in which Cameron slowly shows the restaurant filling up with water, and he really didn't want to delete this scene because of its significance with the relation to the sinking of the ship itself, but was eventually forced to cut it because it didn't really add to the story. So it's safe to say that Cameron is really much more interested in the ship itself. The ship Titanic is the main character, rather than Jack and Rose, who are just the vehicle to explore the ship. In the National Geographic documentary Titanic, The Final Word, which came out in 2012, Titanic researcher Bill Sauter talked about finding Titanic artifacts that were brought up to the surface from the wreck.
And then all of a sudden somebody opens up this satchel, this leather satchel, and out comes the fragrance of heaven. It's all these flowers and fruity flavors, and it's delicious. It's the most wonderful thing you've ever had. It was just a complete, overwhelming experience. It was like all of a sudden the fragrance of heaven, kind of goes through the room.
I think this moment highlights what Cameron's film is trying to do, to really bring to life something that's dead, to raise, the wreck to life. And in order to do so, I think that Cameron realized that he would have to tell a love story, and a very epic love story. Of course, there were probably also studio influences. In fact, there definitely were. But what is more life-affirming than a love story? So the love story between Jack and Rose, especially considering how epic it is vital to bringing the ship to life in this way, which is Cameron's main concern with Titanic. Rather than, for example, as we see in A Night to Remember, focusing on the stories of people on board. I think that Cameron's obvious interest in the ship, predominant interest in the ship itself, even influences the way he portrays certain real-life characters. When we look at the fact that the ship designer, Thomas Andrews, but also the owner of the ship, were both on board, both have received vastly different treatments, not just in Cameron's movie, but down through the years. Andrews, who was the managing director of Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast that designed the Titanic, was very well liked by his workers and by the crew of Titanic, and generally described in a very sympathetic way. Whereas Bruce Ismay, who survived the disaster while Andrews didn't, Ismay was also known to have his own fair share of controversies. I think that not only is Cameron following in the line of this general portrayal, but I think that even when we look at his portrayal of Andrews, the ship designer, in contrast to Captain Smith, whom you can see he really does put a lot more blame on in the movie, it's because of Andrew's close connection with the ship. Andrew's designed the ship with love, at least in Cameron's version.
Won't you even make a try for it?
I'm sorry, but that didn't build you a stronger ship, young Rose.
At another barrier, a seaman held back Cathy Gilnagh, Kate Mullins and Kate Murphy. On the Titanic, all Irish girls seemed to be named Catherine. Suddenly, steerage passenger Jim Farrell, a strapping Irishman from the girls' home county, barged up. "Great God, man," he roared. "Open the gate and let the girls through." This quote is from A Night to Remember by Walter Lord, the book that inspired the film.
How did you escape?
Well, we were standing on the steerage, third class they call it, and then we couldn't get up to second. And of course then there was one man with us, and he was our guardian angel, and he said, for God's sake, let the women up.
Well, let's go! Let's go, Rose. You can't go out there! You can't go there!
Tommy Ryan is only a minor character in the Titanic film, though he does leave an impact. And in the second half of the film, he really does have much more to do than in the first half, where he's mainly a vehicle for exposition. I think that the character of Tommy Ryan is definitely based on this real-life person, Jim Farrell, who did go down with the ship, and who is described by Cathy Gilnagh in her own testimony as her guardian angel. Other Irish survivors of Titanic, including Eugene Daly and Daniel Buckley, had experiences similar to Tommy Ryan, so I would say that Cameron also based the character on these witness accounts. Eugene Daly witnessed a rush on the lifeboats towards the end of the ship's sinking when nearly all of the lifeboats were gone. Daly, along with some others, did witness an officer, apparently an officer of the ship, committing suicide. It's been a great point of controversy who that officer was, especially since Cameron chose to portray it as Murdoch, as First Officer Murdoch, when it's some dispute whether it was Murdoch or Wilde. Then there's also the account of Daniel Buckley, who gave testimony during the inquiries after the Titanic that the gates were indeed locked to keep third-class passengers below. And we see this account, as well as Cathy Gilnagh's account, being folded into A Night to Remember by Walter Lord, being included in the A Night to Remember film, and then making its way into Titanic 1997 from there. So I think this highlights an interesting contradiction in terms of Cameron's approach to the Titanic, where on the one hand he's very meticulous about recreating and being faithful to these witness accounts, and was careful not to take huge liberties with the source material. But on the other hand, as we've already seen, his film really does greatly simplify other aspects of the experience of people on board, and in general doesn't really seem to be his priority. I would say that when it comes to the fictional characters in Titanic, that's where the film really struggles. Whereas with the real life characters, because Cameron is limited in terms of what he can actually portray, because he needs to portray it closer to reality, I think the film is a lot stronger in those aspects.
Just a little while before they were ready to swing out, I happened to meet the captain. And I asked him, by cupping my hands over his ear and yelling at the top of my voice, "Shall I get the women and children away, sir?" He just nodded. So I started to fill the first boat.
In both A Night to Remember and Titanic, the question of how people act when faced with unimaginable disaster is of course central to the story, because our interest in events like Titanic is because of this same question. We put ourselves in the place of the victims, of the survivors. We wonder how we would have acted in such a situation, whether we would have kept our cool, whether we would have made thoughtful decisions, whether we would have chosen to spend our last moments with our loved ones instead of leaving them in order to survive. In A Night to Remember, though, we get this real emphasis on the stiff upper lip and the nobility of keeping your calm, keeping cool, not giving way to hysterics, not giving way to emotions, but very calmly doing your duty and sacrificing yourself.
I'm not going, Robert.
My dear, I never expected to ask you to obey me, but this is one time you must.
So it's a very English male-centric vision of heroism. The main character in A Night to Remember is the real-life second officer, Lightoller, who, while he did survive the Titanic and went on to fight in World War I, he allegedly opened fire on the survivors of the sunk German U-boat UB-110 in 1918. After said survivors had surrendered, Lightoller apparently refused to accept the surrender. So he is an alleged war criminal. However, we don't get any mention of this in A Night to Remember, where he's portrayed as, unarguably this very heroic, noble and good figure who's just trying to do his best in difficult circumstances. I'm not arguing, of course, that I would have done any differently in, at least in terms of how he behaved on the Titanic, since Lightoller did do his best to save as many lives as he could, and, was, you could say, heroic. But I think that the way that A Night to Remember lionizes him really goes too far. And I think it also bleeds into the film's message about, keeping your cool, if you're a man, sacrificing yourself, putting the women and children first, which is obviously what did happen in the Titanic itself, that women and children first was an unofficial rule that was adopted. But Titanic was actually an outlier in terms of these tragedies. For instance, in the Atlantic and the Arctic shipwrecks of the 19th century, which would have been in living memory at the time of Titanic, all of the women and children passengers died. So Titanic is really an outlier in that sense. Cameron's film takes that original question posed in A Night to Remember, how would we act, more specifically as men, how would we act in the face of disaster, and broadens it, universalizes it to a more general question of agency. How would we act if given the right information, and if given the choice, what would we do?
Please tell me the truth.
Yes, madam, please put it on his way.
The ship will sink.
So we see Rose, once she hears about the fact that the ship is sinking, and she is privileged to have this information, whereas many others didn't, then how does she act? She moves to save Jack. She doesn't focus on saving herself, and she doesn't succumb to the pressure of her mother or her fiancé, instead chooses to save the man whom she now knows she loves, although eventually he is the one who dies to sacrifice himself for her. So Rose's character development from a passive prisoner of her own privilege, in a sense, to an agent of her own destiny, this character development is at the heart of Titanic. The whole point of Jack sacrificing himself for Rose is that she is now not going to waste the gift of his sacrifice, but rather embrace what is her life, embrace what she wants to do in her life, and live life to the best, to the fullest, and to the best of her ability, which, as we see in the flash forwards in the framing device of the film, she has done. She has lived as an actress, she has travelled, she has married and had children. Rose's character development is not only central to the film's message, which is how would we act in facing disaster, but it also is served by the Irish passengers in the film. Cameron uses the free spirit, not only of Jack. We see that Jack is a free spirit, but also that his companions in third class, his particularly the Irish third class passengers, are similarly uninhibited and living life in a free way, which is what Rose aspires for. The steerage scene, which is now I think rightly made fun of, because it is quite a bit of a silly moment in the film, but it represents the ideal of what Rose wants her new life to be. However, I think that the fact that Cameron uses the Irish passengers and their supposed freedom or lack of inhibition to serve Rose's character development is problematic in itself. When we look at the accounts from survivors of the Titanic, what becomes clear is that psychological barriers played a large part in what happened. Psychological barriers rather than physical barriers, because there has been this emphasis on locked gates which has kind of led to this exaggerated portrayal that we see in A Night to Remember and Titanic, where you have hordes of third-class passengers being locked below decks behind gates while, you know, the ship's crew basically refused to let them through. There were, of course, as we saw, a couple of accounts, including Kathy Gilnagh's and also Daniel Buckley's, which did testify that there were locked gates. However, it wasn't a widespread thing, and certainly in some cases the locked gates were accidental. In other cases as well, the locked gates in question were actually quite short. For instance, the most famous one, which we can see in the documentary Ghosts of the Abyss, when Cameron and his crew visit the wreck, we can see that gate was only actually waist high and it could have been very easily jumped over. However, we know from the accounts that many third-class passengers, in fact, waited behind these gates, even though they could conceivably have jumped over them, because they were waiting for further orders, because they were waiting, they were being obedient, they were obeying authority, and they were waiting for more information.
But you got into the boat.
But I said to the man, I'd like to go with my sister because there was a neighbour with me, and I thought he'd feel, because I didn't want to lose the crowd. I didn't really think it was any danger, but I thought I'd miss them in the dark. Kathy
Gilnagh's own account shows us that she actually didn't realise the danger she was in, and that many others might have had the same reaction. And I think that this fact is probably often neglected because it is a very sad reality. The documentary, The Addergoole 14, which focuses on a group of Irish passengers who were travelling in third class from Mayo, shows as well a similar experience where the 14 passengers who were travelling together as a group actually waited for a long time for further instructions from the ship's crew, waited in their cabins before they realised eventually that nobody was coming. And that was when they came up to the sun deck to try to find lifeboats. And by the time they had arrived, there were only limited spaces available, so only some of them were able to survive. And also the women and children first rule was in force, which actually caused at least one of the female passengers to stay behind since she was pregnant and didn't want to leave her husband. The Irish passengers at least did have an advantage over passengers who couldn't speak English or understand or read English, because the ship's signs, of course, were all in English. And in order to navigate your way through the very complicated underbelly of the ship, you would have had to have an understanding of the ship's signs. One more nuance that is neglected by James Cameron with regards to the Irish passengers and the crew on Titanic is that the Irish at the time were not exactly a united front. The contracted shipbuilders who built Titanic, Harland and Wolff, were known for their sectarian discrimination against Catholics, and most of their workforce was Protestant. And this has very complicated roots in the sectarian history of Belfast, which is where Harland and Wolff are based. And we won't get into that now, but it's worth noting. In fact, an electrician who was working on board Titanic, William Kelly, did write a letter to his friend describing the anti-Catholic discrimination that he was experiencing from the Harland and Wolff workers.
Who plays dominoes? I play dominoes.
This was also focused on in the 2012 docudrama Saving the Titanic, which I do recommend because it does explore the story of the engineers who are working on Titanic, which is a story you don't hear very often, since there does tend to be this focus on the first class experience on Titanic. So in conclusion, Titanic 1997 is far from a nuanced take on Irish identity. The Irish passengers, such as Tommy Ryan, reinforced the film's theme of agency and the way that agency and choice are not available to everyone on board.
Will you give us a chance to live, you limey bastard? I'll shoot any man who tries to get past me, get back, bastard!
Andrews, the ship designer, is also tragic, though in a different way to Tommy Ryan, since Andrews' tragedy lies in the fact that he designed the perfect ship only to see it sink. Cameron's contradictions as a filmmaker in terms of being very meticulous in some ways and very broad in others works into this portrayal in the film, meaning that we do get an oversimplification in terms of the realities of class division, and also a lot of implausibilities, a lot of anachronisms where the characters really don't act the way characters of the era would have acted. We do get also some attention to detail with regards to the individual accounts that Cameron does bring to life in this film. And so on the whole, I would say that I do like this portrayal a lot. I will admit that some of this has to do with the fact that it is an idealized portrayal of the Irish. I think that's endearing. I like that Cameron has this admiration of the Irish so clearly, and the way that he does see them as representing this kind of freedom, even though, as we've seen, the reality is that third-class passengers and Irish passengers, such as Tommy Ryan, would have had very little freedom and very little choice. And I think the only reason why Titanic is able to be kind of uplifting at the end is because Jack, the character, is such a free spirit in himself. He never had any plans. After the Titanic, he was just kind of living his life in a free way. Whereas Tommy Ryan and, Fabrizio of the terrible Italian accent and other characters were actually looking forward to a future, looking forward to, a better life as immigrants to the New World.
I can see the Statue of Liberty already. Very small, of course.
So while I do like this idealized portrayal, it's very far from the reality of what the experience of Irish people would have been. That's really pretty much all I wanted to say with regards to this film. As I said, I was on a very deep rabbit hole of all things Titanic. I wanted to keep this discussion focused on the 1997 film, but in the description of this video, I will include links to documentaries that I recommend. I do also recommend Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, which is very easy to read and kind of written like a novel, blending together the experiences of different passengers on the ship and crew on the ship from first class to third class. So I would really recommend that as well. Thank you very much for watching and listening. Please do weigh in the comments on your views on Titanic, and I will see you next time. Bye.